So you have the latest crime statistics from the Western Cape out yesterday, painting a really grim picture. We've seen murders rising by more than 9% in the second quarter of the year, or August turning out to be the deadliest month. They're recording 77 gang-related killings as gun violence continues to keep our communities in a vice grip, particularly in Cape Town. More recently, there's been a series of shootings reported across the country, including the killing of popular radio and club DJ Warris in the Johannesburg CBD. So questions are mounting over who owns the firearms, where they are coming from. Let's talk about this with Gideon Jubber, who's from the South African Gun Owners Association, and Gideon is joining us from Cape Town. Gideon, good morning. Thank you again for being with us. Appreciate your time. Before we get into some of the real issues and the deeper issues in our chat today, I'm given to understand that you did know Warwick Stock. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about him and his brutal murder in the Johannesburg CBD.
I'm absolutely gutted by it. I think we've lost someone that was known to speak plainly, that was a straight shooter, that demonstrated an immense amount of courage in the way that he spoke about social issues, and that he's irreplaceable in that regard. And it does hit home very hard. And to me personally, Warwick is yet another tragic casualty in a string of tragic casualties where people are being brazenly murdered in broad daylight, facing no consequences. And it just kind of illustrated to me again that in this country, each and every one of us really is a hostage to violent, politically connected criminal groups, that the moment we become a problem for them, they feel absolutely nothing to simply wipe us out and erase us. And the chances of them facing any meaningful consequences at the current situation is basically zero. And that is something I think as people, we really need to take stock of and urgently do something about it.
At the center of a number of these incidents and the way that people are dying in South Africa is down the barrel or through the barrel of a gun. It brings into question our laws around firearm controls. It also brings into question the debate around the proliferation of illegal firearms into the system. To share your thoughts about those, maybe to share some of the trends that you've seen as well.
So with regards to who's got the guns in South Africa, we have there are two categories. There are people that own firearms legally, of which there are about 3 million firearms licensed in lawfully held hands. And then, depending upon which statistics you use, I like using the Global Small Arms Survey one because they're the most rational and believable and the most thorough. There's about 3 to possibly 6 million firearms in unlicensed hands. So only about 50% at best of all guns in South Africa are legally owned. The other 50% plus are illegally owned by people that can be anyone from criminals to, I suppose, at the lower end of the scale, you'd have people that are just so desperate to protect themselves that can't comply with the legislation, that rather take a chance breaking the law than be defenseless. But that's the situation that we have. I see, I believe it was a provincial commissioner of SAPS in the Western Cape made the very good point in the revelation about the cross-border smuggling. That's a massive problem. And then the other thing that we don't talk about enough is the fact that there's about 2.2 million firearms in state hands, of which only 30% belong to the SAPS, and only the SAPS, the police are the only entity that actually reports on the status and location of the guns in their possession or under their custodianship. The other 70% of that 2.2 million firearm number, we have absolutely no idea where they are, in whose hands they are, and what they're being used for. So we have multiple problems regarding this issue in South Africa. Legislation is powerless to do anything about it. There was a great study by the Wits School of Governance for the Civilian Secretariat of Police that looked at the effectiveness over a 15-year period of the Firearms Control Act on gun, or rather on violence itself and crime. It found that fewer than 5% of all crimes is relevant to the FCA, and that it had no meaningful impact on crime and violence trends at all. And that what did have an impact on crime and violence trends is, in fact, the level and strength of policing. And when we're looking at conviction rates for murder in this country that sit under 10%, conviction rates, successful conviction rates for rape that's under 7%, and conviction rates for trio crimes, which would be vehicle hijackings, robbery, residential premises, and robbery at non-residential premises, that average under 2.5%. we have to also ask the question, well, if people know that they're going to get away with violent crime, and we have no shortage of violent crime, then maybe we should start attaching guaranteed consequences to violent crime as per the constitutional mandate of the South African Police Service and the National Prosecuting Authority.
Yeah, I mean, it's concerning, and as you say, this is also the lived experience of South Africans. You have high crime rates, but low punishment or enforcement or prosecution rates. I want to go back to the 70% in the system of those 2.2 million firearms, of which 30% are in the hands of police. I mean, ostensibly, it would be in other law enforcement. It would be in the SANDF. I mean, just tease that out for us. And if we don't know where they are, what is your impression of what the government has done to find out and do something about it?
Well, there are 550 separate state entities. Sorry, not 550, 502 separate state entities that own these 2.2 million guns. And before her untimely death, Miss Jenny Irish Kolobane did a in-depth study for I think it was the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, where she detailed the difficulties in actually ascertaining where these guns are. Now, bear in mind, there are many parastatals that own firearms. Eskom owns guns, PRASA owns guns, numerous traffic departments, provincial and metro own guns. There's a long list. I'm not exactly sure what exactly the 502 entities entail, but that's where 70% of these state-owned guns are, and it's entirely a black hole for us. We have no idea who all these entities are and where these guns are. Well, someone will know, but whether or not they can tell you what the status of these firearms are, the fact that it's difficult to ascertain it means that the reporting mechanisms, the reporting and bookkeeping methodologies and registries of these firearms are pretty much all on paper. There's no digitalization. And that's also one of the main issues that we from Gun Owners SA has always had with the way that the police and state entities keep track of firearms, is the fact that the process in many places, there is no digital database. They're kept on individual registries spread throughout the entire geography of South Africa. Unless you do a physical audit with an army of people to go through these registries, you'll have no idea if there's fraud or if there's criminality. And there was the High Court order in favor of forensic data analysts to, I think it was the amount of 644 million rand that the SAPs have to pay them for using, kind of stealing their intellectual property to try and keep track of evidence and firearm registries, kind of indicates the level of dysfunction we're sitting with in SAPs, not just with the basics of visible policing, but even the basics of bookkeeping of things as important as firearm armories and evidence stores.
Yeah, and it's very concerning because, especially given what we've heard at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, they're predatorial forces who benefit from a state of dysfunction. They get in there into those perforations and they take over and take root. I want to pivot the conversation to actual gun ownership. And of course, as the South African Gun Owners Association, we know where you stand on the issue. And when we think about those crime stats that were released for the Western Cape alone, we saw that 9% increase in murders. Critics, Gideon, are arguing that more guns in the system, even legal guns, inevitably will lead to more deaths. How do you respond to communities, especially those who are under fire every single day in those, crime hotspots in the Cape Flats, in the Western Cape, who want fewer firearms overall because they are living with constant gunfire?
Firstly, I have great sympathy for their plight, because living under siege effectively for 24/7 for your entire life is not what any person should be going through. The people in the Cape Flats are living in an active war zone. The homicide rates there rival and exceed the civilian death rates in active contemporary war zones. So it is not, I think, it is not an exaggeration to call it that. The problem with calling for fewer guns overall is the fact that by taking guns away from people who aren't committing crimes with them, and in fact have legitimate, necessary uses for them, including protecting their families and their communities, doesn't have any impact whatsoever on the criminals running around with illegally held firearms on the Cape Flats and elsewhere. And I think we mustn't forget that at least 2,300 and probably multiple thousands more of the guns that are being used on the Cape Flats right now to kill people were sold to the gangs by corrupt policemen and in all likelihood, as far as we can see, are being continued to be sold to gangs by corrupt policemen. So unless we start fixing the basic things here of getting law and order imposed on the Cape Flats, which is as difficult as it seems, not rocket science, it's just something that needs to be done. Unless we start getting that right, then the killings and the violence will continue. And my question is, why is the state allowing gang wars and taxi wars to continue unabated? Where's the crime intelligence gathering? Where's the identification of the people behind this? Why are they not being cracked down on from the top down and bottom up, taken off the street, arrested, processed, the guns confiscated and destroyed? Why are these basic things not happening? Because we can write any law. We can write a law right now and pass it. We can get the president's signature on it that says all civilian firearm ownership of all firearms is immediately prohibited. Now what? The criminals are certainly not going to be queuing at the latest police station to hand their guns in. In all effect, they'll be queuing at the nearest police station to buy the guns the 3 million lawful gun owners have just handed in to the cops because they're not allowed to have them anymore.
I mean, that's interesting, and I wonder, and we don't have the time to go into, global best practice around where this might have happened, what trends were observed in terms of reducing the proliferation of firearms or restricting them to enforcement, ownership or use. Why would you advocate, Gideon, in this environment where a lot of people are feeling unsafe? As a woman myself who's been hijacked before, why would you advocate for the ownership of guns? Are you advocating for the ownership of licensed firearms to civilians in South Africa? Also, we have that stat where people are killed more often, with their own firearms than with the firearm that's brought into a potentially criminal situation.
So we're definitely for the lawful and responsible ownership of firearms. And I would just recheck that stat because I think Africa Check debunked it a couple of years ago. It was a very infamous one that did the circuits. And poor Dr. Anthony Altbecker got dragged into the fray there because his work was being misused by a certain NGO in SA, and he distanced himself from it. But the reality of this, I'll do a very quick thing on international comparisons. Per 100 people, South Africa owns fewer guns than Australia, than New Zealand, Austria, Finland, Canada, France, Italy, Germany, the list goes on. So the proliferation of firearms that we supposedly have doesn't really exist. What we do have is that we have guns in criminal hands. Half of our firearms are potentially in criminal hands. They don't obey the law, and they're being allowed to perpetrate crime and violence with impunity, with absolutely no consequences or punishment attached whatsoever. And this is where the viewers on the poll are being very smart. They actually understand exactly what the issue is. The reason why we advocate for firearm ownership, apart from the other legitimate uses of them, is that ultimately each and every one of us is the first responder to our own personal emergency. The police aren't going to be there to save us. And ultimately what we can do in those critical moments, that doesn't always involve the application of lethal force. But if you do need to fight for your life and you're incapable of doing it because the state has prevented you from owning the necessary tools and acquiring the necessary skills, then ultimately we are all just walking victims waiting for a time and a place for bad things to happen to us, and what is increasingly becoming a mafia state where the politicians themselves are going out of their way to protect criminals that are just gunning our friends down in the street. So I think the first step to making a change, apart from demanding political accountability for what's going on, is to also enhance and take ownership of our personal safety and our own personal resilience.
This definitely does warrant more conversations, Gideon, particularly in the context in which South Africa is right now, to the point, and we're having this conversation, you can see Patricia de Lille on the side of your screen, advisories from other countries warning about crime and higher levels of criminality in South Africa for people planning to travel here. And to get back, and thanks again for pointing out that particular statistic, is to bring the facts, the contemporary facts that prevail in gun ownership and this debate in South Africa back into the public focus. So thank you again for your time this morning.